You probably are. All right. So we are recording this webinar. We're happy you're here for ethical grant management. Why did we pick this topic? Well, maybe you've received government funding for the first time. Maybe with all the American Rescue Plan Act and infrastructure money coming down the pike, you're interested and you're about to apply for some bigger grants. Well, let's say you get a government grant. It's not just one and done. There's a lot of compliance requirements to manage your grant, and actually any grant you get. So today's session, we're going to help you think about organizational resources, tools, and strategies so that you can manage your grant well and hopefully get renewed funding. With us today, we have two terrific speakers. I'm very excited. We have Dr. DaMia Harris-Madden. She is the executive director of the Westchester County Youth Bureau, and she's kind of a Renaissance woman in my book. She knows both sides of the grant world. She has been a nonprofit leader. She's written grants for nonprofits. She's a program evaluator with a doctorate in education and executive leadership. On that side of the fence, she's raised millions of dollars in government grants. So she knows how to raise the money, and then she also was involved in compliance as a grantee. She is now on the funder side, representing the County Youth Bureau today, and in that role, she's responsible for awarding grants and compliance in her role as executive director of the Westchester County Youth Bureau. So she brings that terrific perspective. And also with us is Domenica Polenti. She is the CEO and founder of Impact Life, a recovery and re-entry program. I looked at her bio. She has a lot of credentials. I'm sure hard-earned, well-earned credentials, reflecting 26 years in the field of behavioral health. But she is joining us today because she has developed tools and strategies to manage large government grants. She now manages a budget of over $1 million, and she's been very successful. And I will give another shout out to GPLH board member Deborah Brown, who's helping her with grant writing at this point.
Allison, forgive me. I just want to say it's Prasanti.
Prasanti. Sorry.
It's okay.
I wrote it wrong. Sorry.
It's okay. I answer to everything. No worries.
Sorry. Prasanti. Sorry. Okay, so let's get going. Let's start with an easy question. Sometimes those of us that write government grants, federal grants, we have to deal with supplement, not supplant. So, Dr. Harris-Madden, will you just talk about what do we need to know about supplement, not supplant? What's the difference? Why is it important?
Sure, and thank you for that introduction. I hope that you can hear me clearly. I have my headset on, but with these multiple machines, it's sometimes a challenge, so great. And thank you again for inviting me to address the body. I've had a great time in person in the past presenting for you. And this topic is very, very timely in that the Westchester County Youth Bureau, which is an office of the county executive of George Latimer in Westchester, we just completed a round of RFPs, and we will have new grantees coming into our fold in 2023. And so hopefully some of you have written for your clients, and I'm sure that the professionals here have heard or are very aware of the difference between supplanting and supplementing. But since the question has been asked, I will say that often we think of federal grants only when we're mentioning supplementing and versus supplanting. And there is a difference, and it does apply to local and county government as well as state government funds, but also independent funds. So when we think about supplanting, it occurs when there's grant funds that are used to replace existing fund allocations. And by that, it's if you have money set aside or budgeted for the particular operations, whether it's activities or programs that you already have earmarked for that program or that particular function, yet you secure a grant and go, great, I can now, not use that funding for that. I can now use the grant for that. And so that is what we call supplanting. That is not what the grant is for. The grant is for the use of federal, state, local funding, independent funds to either enhance a program or to develop a new program. And so we want to really be careful. It's a very slippery slope. And I know that it still happens. And sometimes inadvertently, we do this. But a perfect example is when you're in, let's say, a municipality and, we'll take something not related to what I do. We'll look at, the Department of Public Works, for example, and the, municipality passes a budget that includes vehicles for the Department of Public Works. Yet they learn that their grant has been approved and they are going to receive money from Westchester County, for example, to fund fleets and new vehicles. Well, actually, you've already set aside the money for these vehicles. So, the intent would be for you to purchase vehicles that are not budgeted for. And so that is what we call supplanting. It's very easy to confuse supplanting with supplementing, because in supplementation, we actually use the grant funds to enhance and not replace. And supplanting is considered replacing. And so you're in jeopardy when you do that, particularly if you get audited, because in order to look to see, exactly how you're funding and or if a program monitor comes out and they notice that you actually have used the funds for the same activity, that would be considered supplanting, and there are consequences to that. When you replace the funds, you are in jeopardy possibly of losing those funds. And often, an auditor may catch it in an audit, or a program administrator comes down at the end of the program, and then you're stuck, because if there's an issue of supplanting, then that money must be repaid. So that's the danger, and the reason why we talk about really making sure that folks who apply for funding sit down with their finance people and really understand how the monies will be used, and to continuously monitor so that we don't see supplanting happening, or that you don't run the risk of supplanting, not intentionally, but by mistake. So I hope that answers the question for you, Allison.
I think that was a great answer. That was very thorough. So thank you. And Domenica, anything you want to add from your end on that? That was pretty thorough, but let's.
Sure. Yeah, no, I would agree. The one thing I think on the provider side, for me is making sure that from the front end, when we're applying for grants, we're looking at that, right? We're going, okay, well, and the hardest part, I think, for a grant writer or for a program administrator, and this happens to me, is I have a program idea in my mind, and that program idea might be applicable to 3 different RFPs. So over the course of time, 3 different RFPs come out, and we may write that same concept because we want to ensure that we get it, right? And then let's say you get 2 of the 3 grants and you have the same idea on both, right? So for us, we always have a backup plan when we're grant writing. So one of the ways that we do that is, if we're going to write the same concept for multiple grants, we'll write by county. So we'll say, okay, we're going to write for this concept. For us, we really want this clubhouse. If we get the first grant we wrote for, we're going to do it in Newcastle County. If we happen to get the second one, we'll do it in this county. That way that there's no issue in us getting 2 pots of money to run one program, right? So I think always kind of just having a backup plan in your mind, if you're going to write for one concept to multiple funders, that's definitely one way to kind of prepare you and be proactive versus, like Dr. Harris-Madden mentioned, what you don't want is to get caught up on the back end. And it does happen unintentionally. I mean, there are people that have the best of intentions, and if your documentation, your fiscal documentation isn't clear enough, it can appear to be supplanting when it's really not, right? If you have people that are allocated to your grants in different percentages, and maybe one isn't updated during an audit, you may have it allocated correctly, but if your financial documentation isn't in line with exactly what you're providing from a service delivery standpoint, you can find yourself in a little bit of trouble there. So that's all that I would add to that.
Go ahead.
Nope, that would be all that I would add to that. I think it's just really important to have a backup plan, right? And then definitely make sure that your fiscal documentation is very clear in how you're allocating staff. If you get additional money and it is supplementing, right? You're using certain staff or even money to pay for certain program supplies, things like that, that you can very clearly see what is paid by what funder, and what those allocations look like. I think that is so important, and it should be a priority for every organization.
We're going to come back to that, like how do you make sure your allocations are
Yeah.
smooth? We'll get to that in a minute because that's so important. But since our topic is called ethical grant making, I just want to throw that word out and just ask both of you again, how do ethics impact your work? So Dr. Harris-Madden, as a grant maker, when we say ethics, what do we need to be thinking of? What do you think of? And I know when we did our sort of pre-talk, we talked about who owns the grant writing and all kinds of things. So have at it.
I think the bottom line is, integrity. We are all professionals, and Dominica said it best. We operate from a place of best intention, especially for our clients. As a grant writer, I know for me, I wanted to chase every single thing moving because there was just such incredible need when I served in a municipality that is probably one of the highest needs communities in Westchester County. And so, the ethics behind that, however, is let's start with the basics. Let's look at what's reasonable and what's achievable instead of throwing everything in but the kitchen sink, as we used to say, right? That was the language that grant writers we use. Throw everything in but the kitchen sink, and we'll see what sticks. However, we know once we are awarded, it's very difficult to do everything, and we have to be very targeted in our approach. And so as a grant maker, we have an independent process. I'm very, although we don't have to, there are opportunities where we don't go through a big RFP process, and there's maybe smaller pools of money, or perhaps I get a call that says, hey, Dr. Madden, we have money available to address X issue, and then we have applicants that we consider. And so not too often do I stray from the formula, which is really the RFP process, so that we have independent reviewers. And I want to just thank some of you who have actually reviewed for us. And I also want to thank some of you who have written historically for us. But that said, we want to make sure that your application is first reasonable. Is it doable? We don't often have a whole lot of money, although we are fortunate to fund currently, in my capacity, we have over 200 different programs that we fund, over 100 agencies that we fund, but we are not giving out millions of dollars. In the county level, yes, we do give larger grants, but in this context, we don't give a whole lot out. So if we see an application with everything but the kitchen sink for $50,000, we know that that's not reasonable. So we want people to, stay true to their mission, make sure that all of their, goals and objectives and activities make sense. The other thing as a grant maker is big for us, and I'll flash my credentials, outside of being an evaluator, all of that. I started out in the private sector, and have a master's of business administration and a master's in HR. So in working within those spaces, and also from my educational capacity, it's like I'm looking at your budgets, where some people may not put as much emphasis on that, because budgets, yes, they can always be fixed, they can always be modified, but for me, there's that big connection between the budget piece and actually what's being proposed as an activity. And is there alignment there that makes sense? So ethics come in when you say, okay, I want to purchase 100 laptops, and our intent is good because we want to address the digital divide. yet nothing in your application speaks to using the technology. So why are we purchasing those laptops? And so you might be thinking, well, DaMia, why are we talking about that part of it? But there's the ethical piece, because is there a clear intent to utilize that technology? Are we being honest about it, or are we just trying to stock a computer lab that may or may not be used? So that's one thing that kind of strikes a chord for me, is making sure that the elements of the budget make sense with the grant application. You know, another thing is a lot of us don't know each other, but some of us are familiar with the organizations, and you don't want bias to creep in when you're making decisions, but trust is really important. And so when we operate with a system of, you know, like trust with one another and like credibility, that helps, because, you know, we want to make sure that we're funding organizations that we know are going to do the right thing, that have demonstrated commitment. And even for the newer organizations, we recognize that they may not have received government funding in the past, may not have had the capacity to apply, and have finally arrived at that point, but have been doing the work for many, many years, investing much of their sweat equity, much of their own resources. And so, you know, we just want to make sure that when we're looking at those proposals, that we have a basis of trust for that funding. So that means understanding, do they have the capacity to operate? You know, will they kind of comply with our ethical standards, and not, maybe not purposefully violate, you know, but not engage in activity that could compromise their grant. We're looking at that. And then, of course, for those who do have a history, we want to look at performance, right? We want to look to see if historically you've received funding that, you know, you have been able to keep good records and allow for us to come visit your programs, and you're making an impact in the community. And, you know, we want to make sure that, like, just at the very basis, you're compliant with like reporting and things of that nature. So, I mean, I could go on. I don't want to, you know, not share the space and time with Dominica, but there's so many areas as a grant maker we look at, but at its face, we really just want to understand and know that you are committed to your mission, and that this funding is not going to be used to replace, instead enhance your operation so that you can do more of the service in the community.
It's a good start, I think. Thank you so much. And let's pitch it over to Dominica to add to ethics from your perspective.
Sure. I think for me, one of the things that one of my mentors taught me very early on, and it's interesting, right? She said to always keep in mind that there's no such thing as an original idea when it comes to grant writing and program development. And I think when I keep that in my mind as a grant writer and as a program administrator, it forces me to always give credit in what I'm writing, right? So if we're writing a proposal and we have this idea that we think is great, really challenging ourselves to say, well, is this an original idea? Did we hear about this from somewhere? Are we taking an idea from a program that operates in another city and state? Let's credit that organization. It's only going to help anyway, right? If there's a program that operates and they have really good outcomes, then let's say, hey, we saw this program, we read the data, they have great outcomes, and we think it would benefit this demographic and population here. When we write, we're going to say that, right? One of the things that I've come into contact with is other grant writers who don't necessarily always credit the original source. And I just think from an ethical standpoint, it's amazing to give another organization credit for one. And if they're doing great work, let's not reinvent the wheel and say we're going to replicate it, especially if they have great outcomes for a similar population. But let's give credit where credit's due. I think that's one of the biggest things. And then, you know, following scope of service, right? So myself, right, I've seen a grant and I'm like, I get very excited. I'm like, oh, I want this money. This is great. And I can do A, B, D, and F. But I don't know about these other two things. And what I've tried to really work on my team with is we have this kind of philosophy at Impact, which is like sub what we can. So anything that we can't do, let's find a subcontractor that can do it. Because I would rather approach a funder and say, we are excellent at these three things. this thing, we have a little bit of experience, but we're not as good at it, but we have this amazing partner that can work with us, and together we make this dream team. So, you know, we sub out what we can't. And if we can't find a subcontractor that we trust, that we vetted, that we are comfortable with our name being connected to, then we'll simply write in the grant, we're not necessarily comfortable writing for this service. And I always like to say why. Because I think for grant writing, you're also developing partnerships, right? It's not just we're writing this proposal and submitting it. We're telling you who we are, and we're hopefully creating this partnership. So we very recently wrote a grant for it was for transitional housing for youth and case management services. And you could write for both, or you could write for them separately. And we are just not in a position to offer the housing side. But I wanted them to know that we're working towards that. And for me, I think that's a responsible statement, right? We don't currently have the capacity to take on youth transitional housing, but we are very, very well set up to do the case management. And in the future, we are interested in that should another opportunity arise. Because now they know that, one, we're being honest. From an ethical standpoint, we're saying right now, today, we can't do this, but we are interested. And in the future, if an opportunity arises, you know, we're interested. So I think it's honesty and integrity, you know, just I'm kind of repeating, right, what Dr. Harris-Madden said, but I think it's being realistic, right? And looking at what you can offer, offering that, giving credit to the original source, following the scope of service, and not fluffing data, right? Like when you're reporting, not fluffing data, right? And I always challenge my team and I say, can you prove it? If they come to me and say, we had 73 people show up at the job fair and we did training on workforce development on 40 of them, I say, can you prove it? How can you prove that, right? Can I see sign-in sheets? Did they sign in and out at a time? I want to make sure that the data that we're reporting isn't because we scanned a room and we think that we counted 71 people and half of them were there for half the time. I want to know that what we're reporting is what we said we were going to do, and that it is factual and provable, right? So if we can't prove it, we don't report it. And I think that that's also really important to instill in your staff from the beginning, from a program operation standpoint.
Could I just jump in, because, you know, Allison, this was brilliant that you put us together, because every time, you know, I hear my colleagues speak, I'm saying, yeah, I'm totally with her. If more could be like you, Dominica, because, you know, it's really so important. Everything you talked about just reinforces what I said earlier, but I just wanted to go back to a couple things. And I'm going to try to go backwards to say, like, the data is so important. I mean, you can misinterpret data and you can tweak data, and we know that, you know, although numbers should be finite, it's not. It's really how you tell the story. And it's very true, because, you know, people often pitch how they're going to serve X number of people. And there is a really big difference between, you know, serving and just counting someone. So, you know, I think I'll use the state, for example, New York State Education Department. If any of you have written for 21st Century Community Learning Centers, you know that that's a huge deal for us in New York State and for the after-school community. And you could get up to, you know, over $1 million each year. It's a huge grant. I've been very successful in securing those grants and also evaluating for those grants. And so they were brilliant when they put in certain metrics to demonstrate the service as opposed to attendance, right? And so not every grant, you know, requires that kind of measurement, but I think but it keeps people very honest. They have to demonstrate, you know, a certain number of hours that young people participated, or a certain number of days as a dosage, and that's reported on, because it's very easy to say, I've served 1,000 young people. And did you really serve them? So the integrity, you know, comes into question, because if a young person showed up twice to your program, can you really, you know, connect that to the outcome? Maybe this young person graduated or their grades were improved. Can you really demonstrate that those 2 days actually was service? Those 2 days could just have been, I popped in with a friend, yeah, it was a nice time, but did I actually was my life improved? Were my grades improving because of those 2 days? I like that you mentioned that because I don't think everyone has that type of integrity. And so, this is not a beat up on grantees day, as I was one of them, because at one point in my career, I was like, wait a minute, this person came 5 times and we can count them. But truly, did they receive a service? Did they really, if you go back to how your objectives are written and what you're seeking to obtain, at least for your clients, did this person really receive positive youth development by coming a couple days out of the week? So I love that you mentioned that. The other thing that you mentioned, you mentioned several things that I liked, but just going back to the transparency and partnership, one of the things as a funder that we've had to implement is, a pass-through standard. And so what I found when I first took on this position, that some organizations were passing through the funds, and that's not what our funding is intended to do. Now, some organizations are allowed to do that. Example being my organization as a government entity responsible for 46 different municipalities with youth services, funding going to them. I'm able to be a pass-through. However, our funding is not intended to be a pass-through because we're passing it along to you to actually implement the service. So for you to then pass it on to someone else, there's a difference between being a pass-through and being a partner. And true partnership is not just signing an MOU. True partnership is also not just passing the money along. It's really about how can we synergize around this issue and how can we leverage and maximize our resources so that we reach the intended population, but we're also offering highest quality of service. And so I think that that's often missed when we do pass through. But if it's set up front, a funding source like me would appreciate that, a statement to say, we are partnering with X organization who has the expertise to deliver X, Y, and Z, right? And then that makes it very clear and there's no ethical concern or question there. You've stated it. So I just wanted to comment on those 2 great points.
Thank you.
Yeah, good discussion. Before we leave this topic, I want one more thing, Dr. Harris-Madden. When we talked before, you talked about who owns the grant, the writing. And you had mentioned that a grant you'd written, you saw later someone else kind of taking ownership for. Since a lot of us are consultants, or can you just comment about that for just a moment, then we'll move on.
Yes, so there have been a few instances where I've recognized my own writing. I like to think I have a distinct way of writing, but it is true that there's really not many original thoughts. Positive youth development, at least in my space, we can wordsmith it all we like, but there's some key tenets there, and also what we are trying to achieve for our young people, which is ultimate self-sufficiency, optimal, physical, mental health. There's just certain things that we all know, and the vernacular is used repeatedly to make the point in the case for what we're seeking funding for. But yes, I think it's problematic when we write for grants and not cite. And that was the other point that did escape me. Thank you for bringing it back. It's better to go ahead and cite a person because you just don't know who's your reader on the other side. I have opened up an application and I'm like, these are my words. I know how I write and I know exactly what I wrote. And so I just ask if you're going to cite me. I recognize that having worked for different organizations that my intellectual capital is really not my own, right? Because I was employed at that time. And so we want you to continue. We certainly want organizations to sustain themselves. And so they may need to dust out an old application. But the expectation is, from an ethical perspective, is have some, transparency there by citing an individual. If you're going to wordsmith, fine. But we always say, at least when I went to school, it's who said it and why, right? And so it's we want to make sure, and so what, right? So who said it, so what? that we need to really make the connection of why you're citing that individual's work and how it's connected back to the application. And it's really disheartening to see that. And because you don't want to pull an application, especially if you know an organization needs it. But I would say for the consultants, if a client hands you their previous application, it's really your ethical responsibility to, look at it and say, okay, there's some good stuff here, but try to develop your own or tweak it so that it becomes more of the organization's initial idea merged with, emergent and new trends. Nothing's worse than looking at a cut and paste job. And unfortunately, today, cut and paste jobs don't always work. They did before. I can speak from experience. They did before. The trends are so emergent, and every, time we blink, there's what was salient yesterday is not salient today. And we have a lot of data that's out there and a lot of articles that we can pull from that kind of validate what is current and what is happening in our community. So, I would just suggest that if anyone's going to look at old proposals, that's fine, but most definitely change the language and integrate some original thought in there so that you protect yourself. Because if the reader on the other end actually wrote it, I'm going to just shout out Lydia for a second, because, this is a perfect example. I think Lydia's on the line. I think I saw her earlier. Hi, Lydia. Okay. So we were scheduled to do a presentation one time in New York State, and it was on a grant writing kind of, I believe it was a grant writing seminar. And, Lydia had an emergency and I had to step in, and the entire time, if I used anything from Lydia, I was like, and my colleague Lydia, who really wanted to be here today, according to her, she says X, Y, and Z. Even though she and I might have been thinking the same thought, it still was generated from her slide. It was the segment where I could talk about what she had worked on, and it was no detriment to my presentation. In fact, it demonstrated high ethical standard because I'm citing someone who's miles away, who may never have even heard about what I said during that discussion or not. But just for me, it was important to give her the, credit and to recognize her work and contribution.
Thank you. Nice shout out. Thank you. All right, we're going to move on. I think that was a good discussion about ethics, but when you said miles away, I do want to point out that Domenica's from Delaware. Speaking of miles away. All right, moving on. Let's talk about capacity. We've touched on that. How do you know if you have the capacity to manage a grant? And Domenica, I'll start with you. You referred to reading RFPs. How do you know if you have the capacity? What does it take to really run a government grant, systems and things?
Yeah, so we go by, in my brain, our capacity is going to drive our performance, right? Our capacity and our ability to do what we have committed to is going to determine how successful we are or not in some cases, right? So for us, every time we get an RFP or I see an RFP, I have this process where in my mind, I go through a few things. So the very first thing is this aligned with our mission, vision, and value? In my experience, I have found that if it's not, and I try and go out on a limb, if the staff aren't used to the population and it's new or different and it's not something everyone is fired up about and excited about, I may then not have the buy-in from the current staff, right, to be able to roll out as successfully as I would like. And if I preach to my team that this is our mission, vision, and value, we need to stand by that, right? And I think it also prevents you from going down rabbit holes. So if you're an excitable person like me, and Dr. Harris-Madden mentioned it when she said we would go, you would go after everything, like whatever it is. Yes, I want that. I need that to run the program, and it's more money, so let's go after it. A lot of my career, I did that. And what we found was that we would then have programs that were not running at the performance levels that we wanted, right? Or you'd have, you know, not as much energy or excitement in some of those programs because it just wasn't aligned with your mission and vision, right? So that's the biggest thing we do is, does this match our mission, vision, and values? The second thing is it part of our strategic plan? And that's very hard for me because I, in my brain, can twist our strategic plan to meet whatever need I feel like I see in the community that I want to serve. But as a leader and an administrator, that's not responsible, right? So our strategic plan should guide a lot of the decisions that we make. So the second thing we ask is this aligned with our strategic plan? Would our board members look at this and go, oh, this is great, this fits perfectly with impact? I also think there's anomalies, right? There's things that'll come up where, you know, you'll say, well, this kind of fits, but maybe not, but we think that this would be of added value to the populations we serve, and there's a need in the community. So yes, I can justify that. But if it's something that's totally out of scope, you know, I think you have to give that a second, third, and kind of fourth thought, right? I cannot stress resources and infrastructure and culture enough. Making sure that you have the infrastructure and figuring that out for me is always assessing the organization's capacity. So doing that by saying, we actually had a meeting yesterday with my leadership team, and I said, there are 2 HIV grants that just released today. I love the idea of these grants. They're case management. They're aligned with our mission and vision, but we're not providing HIV services right now. And there are multiple organizations in the county and in the state that do that. How do you all feel about passing on that? They're 2-year grants. They're going to come back up in 2 years, and maybe we'll be better aligned then. And my leadership staff, sometimes, you know, in a case like that, someone will say, Dominica, this is really near and dear to my heart. I have experience in this. Maybe you don't know that I ran a program like this 5 years ago, and I'll hear them out and I'll listen to them. And then I'll say, are you interested in helping write the grant? Right. And then we come to a decision together. But I'm, you know, I think it's really important to take an honest look, and not your version of what your passion is driving you to see, but an honest look at your organizational capacity, who the staff is in charge. Do they have the ability to take this program on in the event that you get it? Can you do it? Does it align with your culture? Is it something that's going to require 10 hours of training a month for the first 6 months just to get up off the ground running? And do you have the time to do that if it does, right? So I think it goes back to, like, we all believe that our organizations have the potential to do a lot of things, but from a true capacity standpoint, if we take an honest look, do we have the resources? Do we have the infrastructure? Does it meet our culture? Do we have the knowledge, right, to do all of those things? And does it meet our mission, vision, value, and strategic plan? We're currently working on a checklist to make it easy, right? So here's a checklist. Can we check 8 out of the 10 boxes? And if we can check 8 out of the 10 boxes, or whatever number, you know, you come up with, for us, it would have to be 7 or 8 of those boxes, then yes, we will write for the proposal. And if not, let's jot it down and we'll look at it when the opportunity comes up again.
This is great. Thank you. And now I'm going to bat it back to Dr. Harris-Madden and talk about, when you evaluate a grantee, what are you looking for in terms of capacity?
Sure. So many of the things that Dominica has already said, we start with, I was shaking my head about the readiness checklist because, you know, I've certainly created those for clients. And, you know, it's something that's really important just to, you know, check our boxes off way before a grant is even released. Many of us kind of hear wind of things that are coming, and some of us know the timeline. So we're like, the 5-year, you know, grant period is coming to an end. I better start gearing up or getting my clients ready for this. And, you know, even looking at grants that may not be specific to the wheelhouse. I love the idea of basing, you know, your strategy off of the strategic plan, because in that ensures that you're in alignment with the mission. But then there's also opportunities where you may say, I might go astray here, but am I actually ready for that? So I think starting with what does capacity really look like? I mentioned earlier that one of the things that I really appreciate about being in this job and in this role is that I can work with beginning organizations, beginning in that those that have not received government funding in the past, and really start to prepare them through small pilots. We created this opportunity, and it's not a lot of money, but small pilots so that they become accustomed to what we're going to be looking for. So I'll speak about like from program to budget to, outcomes and evaluation, but let's start with like just the very basis of a checklist. Like, what does my leadership team look like? If I, intend to address the old admin part of it, what role will they play? Personnel, like what type of individuals will I need to hire versus what type of individuals do I have on my team already that and their expertise that matches what the grant is calling for. And the obvious, which has been stated before, like, the mission statement, what it is that we're seeking to achieve, and what are our overarching kind of goals that we have in place. But then from the financial side of things, like from a capacity standpoint financially, do we understand that government entities are, they go through a reimbursement process at a lot of times, more times than I care to count. We have individuals who just don't understand that piece of it. They expect us as government to operate more like a foundation. And when I say to people, when they approach me and ask about funding opportunities, I say, well, let me start by saying we're not anything like a foundation. You will not open up your mail and jump for joy at this big check, not from government, right? That is not how we operate. So you must have cash flow to be able to, appropriately utilize these resources. And so if you cannot demonstrate that the money has been spent within your contract period specifically for these grant purposes, then you will not be reimbursed. And so that in itself is very difficult for folks to understand. From a government perspective, it's insurances before go. We can't even enter into an agreement with you without very specific insurances. And some people are not accustomed to the insurances that we need. So an example is child and molestation insurance. Not every organization is required to carry that, although I think they should, especially when they're dealing with individuals, but specifically children and youth. But not everyone has been asked to do that. They may have received grants in the past, or we call it allocations. I should correct myself. Fund allocations. They may not have received that in the past from a government entity that has required that. This is somewhat new, but not really. But for some people, they've never even heard of that. So that's an example of an insurance that you would have to have. And then the general insurances that you should have anyway, liability, for example. Automobile coverage if you're going to be transporting someone, those are the kind of things that people need to incorporate in their readiness checklist, because it is a financial cost, but also a time cost. Because if you get to a point where, you could possibly be funded, you don't want that to infringe upon your start date or your ability to even secure a grant. We've got to a point where it's like we want to fund an individual organization and unfortunately cannot in the end because they're not able to secure insurances for whatever reason. So that's something that has to be integrated in. And also making sure that tax status is up to par, that, we will look to see, are you a viable entity? Are we able to fund you? There are folks that are on the red list and are not able to be funded. So that's something to consider, especially if you're walking in as a consultant, not knowing all the history of the organization. I would also say that if you're looking, from a grant perspective, we try to be as objective as possible when we're reviewing the grants. I try to find the most qualified reviewers as possible. That's always a huge challenge and burden. But we want, we want a democratic process, so to speak, and we want to make sure that, it's not just the Youth Bureau weighing in on, who gets funding and who does not. But, of course, you should know the area that you intend to serve. Nothing is more frustrating than reading proposals that are similar in nature, offering the same services, organizations that are proposing to do things that are already happening, just not taking a temperature check where they intend to serve. And so it appears as though, you have no real investment in the community if you don't know that there's at least 10 organizations offering the exact same thing that you're proposing in your proposal. But it happens. Some other things to consider is, like your funding sources, having an updated list for funding sources. You want to make sure that you're transparent, and so that we can see that you have a history and you have a track record of receiving funds. And there are some other things that, I think are important. I think we hit the most important thing. What does capacity look like, and are you ready? And then, of course, everyone here, I'm sure, knows, technology failure when you're looking at, submitting your grants. How many times have we gone to, submit in Grants Gateway? Excuse my phone for ringing. And there's tech failure, right? Like, readiness also means being prepared in advance before submitting an application, because we've gotten late submissions because we accept, we timestamp. We're still in the dark ages, not like Grants Gateway where you can apply right online. But things happen, and so we encourage people to always submit their applications ahead of time, because you just never know, and you don't want to run into that risk. But that also, in my view, goes into that readiness checklist. It may be a short-term element, but it's something that we should be concerned about nonetheless. Who's actually dropping off the application? What day and time are they doing that? So that if there's a backup that's needed, you have that ready. So there's a lot there.
That's a lot. That's a lot about the capacity side. So thank you. As we kind of get closer to the end, I want to go back to Dominica and talk about some of this. You've referred to some systems, some financial systems for managing grants. So let's now turn to, you got the grant. What systems, tools are in place to manage it, to make sure the money's not going to be taken back?
Yeah, so one of the things that just in the past, I would say 3 years, 4 years from a systems perspective that has been like a game changer for us is project management software. And it's interesting because originally I was like, okay, we're a nonprofit. How are we going to pay for that? And I used to only think in terms of asking for discounts from people that serve nonprofits. I really had to expand my thinking to just ask for discounts from everyone under the sun, no matter who they are. So we were looking for project management software. And one of the things that we did was, we have a program, it's called Monday. And that's one of the ones that I'm a fan of. We went through a few, but I really like it. Very affordable. It's like $4 per user per month. And we only have about 5 people in it, right? Our evaluators in it, our program managers in it, our data collections person is in it. And basically we set everything up in Monday. That is our report deadlines, our data collection deadlines, anything that are, if we have a disparity statement that's due for our federal grants, once a year on the 30th of whatever month that is, it is set up 14 days before it's due. And that project software then sends reminders. You can tag it to people, you can send notes, you can actually chat. So all of your conversation about those tasks are right in the software. There's apps on the phone, and then it connects to the computer. So it's, to me, a very affordable platform that saves us a lot of mental energy, right? Because I'm not trying to track it in a spreadsheet or any other way. This actually does really what an admin assistant technically, does. We also use Slack, and that's actually free for nonprofits for up to 100 users. And Slack is great for the same types of things, but with Slack, we actually can upload documents and things like that as well. So they were two of the things, they are two of the things that we lean on heavily with our nonprofit. So, in addition to those things, real-time data collection. So, and I say that, so we bought tablets, and our staff that are community-based, as they're doing whatever they're doing for whatever grants, they're updating in a tablet in real time. So that way our data collection person, if she goes in on a Tuesday at 9, she's got data that happened up to probably Tuesday at 8. And having that real-time data is helpful because you never know when you're going to get a call from anyone, right? Our funder might call and say, hey, I saw that you spent $16,000 on this. Can you just give me a little bit of an idea of, you know, what that was for? And I can say, hey, we were in this zip code, which is at risk, and we served 112 residents that day, and, you know, things of that nature. So we put a really big emphasis on real-time live data. I also think it's sometimes hard to play catch up. In my prior roles, we've done data collection at the end of every month. We've done it bi-weekly. And those systems, we lost numbers. There was a lot of times where it was a paper system, someone misplaced a whole folder that might have had a week's worth of data. It just makes more sense for us to have it in real time and do it and use technology to our advantage. So I think those things are really important. And then we use Microsoft Teams for a lot of what we do as well, just because it has a lot of built-in systems, to-do lists, tasks, reminders, all of those things. So we are trying to lean on technology as much as possible, which also can be a barrier. We hire a lot of individuals who are justice involved, who are, you know, coming out of long periods of incarceration and things like that. So while it is a blessing, I will also give you the other side, that if you have people that are not as tech savvy, you have to be willing to invest in the training, which we got a Microsoft grant to be able to do free training for them as well. But making sure when we talk about infrastructure, right, if I'm going to lean on technology heavily, I need to be able to make sure that my entry-level staff who have a year sober and who have never had a real professional job know how to use the technology that we are putting in place to help us that might be very difficult for them. So just keeping all of those things in mind, I think, is helpful.
Those were very, very helpful. Thank you so much. And now, DaMia, from your perspective, what are you seeing, how people, you know, need to manage? And then at what point also should people reach out to you for help if they're struggling with some of these things?
So I would say that we're always available to offer technical assistance. That's why our program administrators are very busy. Especially our financial administrator, you know, he's constantly assisting. I see, I just saw someone that I know receives grant funding from us, you know, and we're always available for that. So that's the last part of your question. But I would just underscore what has been said earlier about systems. Like, you know, the process of optimization is really important to map out. And so that goes along with the readiness that looks at, you know, what systems do we have in place? And let's face it, the reality is many of us are still using Excel. I'll raise my hand to do that because, you know, we don't have the grant management systems in place that we would like. I mean, we've created some for reporting purposes, but you know, we use the old school Excel, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I do think technology is useful, especially if you can train your team to use it and use it properly. So like, if from a financial perspective, we're going to make sure like we're budgeting and planning appropriately, because some of the pitfalls we find is that, again, some of the organizations are not as strong in that area. And so, you know, they kind of pull together a budget, and candidly, some of the consultants that are writing for them, that may not be their strong suit. So they pull together things, not recognizing some of the rules we have in place, even when it's stated within our RFPs. And from our perspective, like if you submitted a response and your application is accepted, we're going to work with you so that you understand, especially with matching components. We have the Invest in Kids program that requires a 35% match, and that must be a cash match. So when we're talking about ethics, you know, we want to make sure that people are not supplanting or double dipping. And so we ask, you know, for the cash match and like proof of cash match, right? So you know, that whole budgeting process is really important. Another thing, the cost allocation plan, you know, staff allocation plan, all of those things may be looked at depending on what you apply to our office for. And so like those processes and procedures should be in place. And we try to offer professional development in a variety of areas. Allison, you presented for us in the past, and you know that, you know, we're really big on trying to give everyone the tools that they need so that they're successful with our funding, but also outside funding. So like looking and analyzing some of the financial things that are in their budget will only help to support the work that they're doing and actually help with the submission of claims and being paid in a timely manner so that we don't have to kick back claims to you. Also the performance metrics, you know, we have a system that we use for reporting. It's very simple. But you know, every grant is different. So like really having the staff in place that's able to understand and get training on how to report out on what's being done and having it make sense as well. We try to take the guesswork out of creating, you know, like objective statements and things of that manage, but we do see, so from a funding perspective, we do see people selecting, even when coded, you know, how they're going to measure their progress in the program and outcomes in the program, yet they're giving us supplemental data that's not really necessary and doesn't really answer the question. So, you know, we want to make sure that individuals understand how to report out and like what they should be. Sometimes less is more, but we have a tendency to want to give a lot of qualitative information because we want to just talk about how wonderful our programs are. And on the other side, it's a little frustrating when the questions get avoided or drowned out by all of the other information. Lisa's nodding her head, so you must know what I'm talking about. It's like we have all of this information when we asked one question that really required one sentence as a response. So that's one of the things that we look at from a programmatic standpoint. But also just looking at like how we're just managing the program in general. Are we being responsible? Are we showing up to like required trainings that we offer? We don't offer a lot of them. So, you know, we're looking for representation within our trainings. And even for those that, you know, seek to be more culturally responsive, in our world, we like to use trauma-informed, but what does that really look like? What does trauma-informed care and personnel look like? So, you know, we look to see if organizations are enhancing their skills and they're reporting out on some of the trainings that they're taking, because it actually helps us to better understand the commitment of the agency and how they're really, you know, serving the population. And I would just say, finally, like those desk audits are really invaluable. I know when I was in an organization providing direct service, I would call my team in and I would say, we're going to go through a mock audit. You know, this is not to scare you or frighten you, but that you're always prepared, because you never know when we will get notified of an audit. And it could be programmatic and it could be fiscal. So let's just sit down. I'm going to give you a template and I'm going to tell you what I'm looking for. And you're going to pretend that I'm your auditor. I'm not DaMia. I'm not Dr. Madden. I am so-and-so from, you know, Connie's and David's, and I'm going to come in and look at your financial record. So I'm going to come in as, you know, New York State OCFS, and this is what I would be looking for. And so I think preparing those that deliver the services at almost every level, because in some cases, a site visit is just as important as an actual audit. And so folks should have, you know, an awareness and understanding of like the various tentacles of their programs. And often we write the proposal, we get the money, and then our staff doesn't understand holistically what the aim is, holistically what we should be doing. So although Dominica may be doing one thing and DaMia is doing another, we should be able to back each other up and talk about that. So, you know, from a funder's perspective, if we show up at your site, you really want to understand what's happening. And so when we don't get responses that reflect that you even understand what's happening, it becomes a little bit of a problem for us. And then finally, I'll say for the subs that are used, you know, what exactly their roles are and like how they enhance the program and what the value is there, because sometimes people sub out. And I hate to say it, but it's just based on experience. They sub out to organizations that actually don't do the program any justice. Actually, it detracts from the program. And it's not often that we see that, but it has happened. And so you question, like, where's leadership's role? And, you know, when you submit claims to us and a subcontractor is not performing on their part, and so either they're not spending down the money, or you as the person in leadership or the lead agency is not, you know, able to compensate the sub because they're not, you know, standing up to their side of the bargain, it impacts the overall performance of the program and the finances of the program. So if you're subbing out, I always say, please make sure you're inspecting what, you know, you're expecting, because that is really important so that you will be successful in your journey here.
This has been so helpful. I hope people follow up on the recording. That was so rich. We're about out of time, but we are having a session on site visits coming up as a follow-up. And I love what you said about doing a mock audit, a program or a financial audit. And that's something maybe GPLH, we might want to think about providing some resources for people to do internal mock audits. And maybe we'll follow up with you about how we might be able to do that. I love that. We have like 3 minutes. I want to open it up for questions. I also want to say we have another funder from the foundation on the call, Patty Horvath from Field Hall Foundation. And I don't know if you might want to chime in, but I'd love to open it up for questions now. And we're so small. You can just raise a hand, and I just want to give you the chance, anybody with a question. Thank you, speakers, so much. Yes, Patty, great.
Allison, hi. I'll just, introduce myself. I spoke earlier before the session started, but I am Patty Horvath. I'm with the Field Hall Foundation, and we've worked with the professional grant writers of Hudson Valley before. It's been a great program. Thank you very much. We, as a new foundation, I was attending to also learn from it, which I have taken a lot of feedback from it. So thank you. I would add just as far as when programs, grantees are realizing that they're not meeting their goals, or they're having trouble meeting their goals in a grant and will not be able to complete it or to even perform it, I would recommend that they reach out to the funder as soon as possible, as opposed to in the final report. As a foundation, we've had it both ways, and we're always willing to work with an organization to see how we might be able to work together to make sure that the grant is successful. So that would be my only input to this.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else with a question on the call? And if not, speakers, do you have any? Okay, Kimberly, great. Unmute and speak away.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to those. I came in a little bit late, so I do apologize. So I am currently new to this. I had the pleasure of meeting this organization at an event held in Tarrytown regarding Nita Lowy. And so I have a question to Dr. Madden and I believe Dominica. I am new. I have started an organization during the pandemic. I am a former employee of a former organization. What advice would you give me? I have created my LLC, I have my tax ID, but I do want to learn about the granting because I want to make sure that we're implementing the right information into the grant. But like I said, I am new to this environment. And thank you for allowing me to ask my question.
So my suggestion would be to definitely find, I would say, a mentor, right? If you're starting out and you're brand new, I would find a mentor. And also I would look at foundations. So we have an amazing foundation here. It's called the Longwood Foundation. And one of the things that they do is they will work with individuals who have never been funded before at all, as long as their mission and vision is aligned. And they actually have a 1-year process. It's a cohort that you go through. And what they do is they teach you how to apply for their money. And they give very large grants here in Delaware, and they also fund Pennsylvania. I say that to say there may be a foundation or organization similar to that. It was a really great process. So you go through a whole year, and at the end of the year, their goal is to have you prepared and ready to write for their grant, but it is designed for people who are brand new to this. you know, I would say start there. I am sure that there are other foundations that offer very similar programming, and definitely find a mentor. You'd be surprised at the amount of people that will help someone who is like just starting out, especially I would say find someone in your area that's familiar with the funders and things like that. But I mentor two other people in Delaware here that are starting out. I think it's our responsibility to give back to the field. That's just my thought. But I think a lot of people have that same kind of mentality. So that's what I would suggest. And good luck to you. Good luck to you. I hope it works out.
And Kimberly, reach out to us, GPLH. We are happy to mentor people along as
Yes.
best we can.
I just became a member, and as Dominica just said, Dr. Madden is in my area. I know her from being over the Westchester Youth Bureau, and I am a part of the Yonkers Youth Bureau. So thank you for that advice, Dominica. I appreciate that.
All right.
Wonderful. Yeah, I would underscore that too. Sponsorship, if you have a nonprofit, is really a very useful way to gain entrance into this world. Because again, we mentioned earlier, the history is really important. So if you are starting a nonprofit, perhaps going under another nonprofit, that would be very useful for you, just even in terms of capacity, how you're able to operate. Whereas in the LLC, you know, there's so many resources in Westchester County through the Economic Development Office here. There are many starter programs where they actually allow you to attend courses and even receive funding as startup costs. So I would say reach out to me separately. I'll put my email into the chat, or go to westchestergov.com under economic development. The Catalyst is run by an amazing woman, Bridget Gibbons, and they have, you know, lots of opportunities for the LLC. And the final thing is, it's always, I've had, you know, panel discussions about LLC versus nonprofits. There's lots of LLCs who operate in this space, in the service industry. And so, you know, they're more of the social entrepreneurs. And so there's space for that. And there's also opportunities within grants where there are, you know, requirements that a lead agency must integrate a MWBE. And that comes a little bit later down the pipe. But, you know, just to get started is really important. So good luck with your incorporation.
Thank you.
All right. I see no other questions in the chat, and I think we're about out of time. So I want to thank you. Both presenters were great. I learned a lot. And Dr. Harris-Madden just put in her email in the chat.
I can add mine. Yep.
And great. You'll all get a copy of the recording, and we hope to see you again. Reminder that our next connection call is December 7th at 8:30. And we're here for you. So I do see some new people on the call. Thank you for coming. We'd like to get to know you better. And any other last words? I didn't introduce my co-president, Nancy Keene. I'm sorry. Give a hello.
That's okay. That's okay.
And Deborah Brown is going to be the incoming co-president starting in January. So I'm sorry I didn't do those introductions. All right, everybody, take care. Have a great day.
Thank you, everybody. That was great.
Take care.
Thank you so much.
That was fantastic.
It was
They were
good. It was very good. I'm very happy. It was a great topic. I wish more people had come.
It'll
But
be on the website, you know.
I think it was really helpful. I love that idea of a mock audit. Never occurred to me.
It's a brilliant thing. It would really help people.
Yeah.
And-
I know Diane Leonard does a mock sort of audit to submit a grant. But this, in terms of,
I mean, readiness.
yeah. But this would be great. So we can talk about a session like that. So thank you. And Dominica's just great. So many practical things. So
She's amazing. And I have to say, I feel a little badly because I feel like I did not give you enough information. You know, I kind of looked at the bio and I thought that that was just fine, but it wasn't
But it was in the blurb. I didn't want to spend a lot of time. I go to these webinars and they spend 5 minutes introducing people. So what I just tried to do is pick the salient, like DaMia is really here as the funder and Dominica is here as the putting systems. Like I just tried to shorten it because they had fuller bios on the,
Yeah, that's fine. I think that's
so
fine.
that's what I was thinking. So next I'm going to send, we do $25 gift cards, right? For thank you.
Yeah.
So I will get that in the works right now. And I think I will send the survey out to everybody that RSVP'd, thank them for coming. And it usually takes, oh my gosh. The
Oh, are we
recording.
recording? We're still recording.